Paul is the co-founder and head of product at Upstart, which issues personal loans powered by machine learning. I met Paul at a different conference, Hereticon, and his talk on like why startup equity is like worth pursuing. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was like great. I think it was the best talk of the entire conference. I had a great time chatting with Paul afterwards, and we found out we had a lot in common, like an interest in prediction markets, namely. He actually offered, I think, the angel invest, like even like way back when, before we even were thinking about raising a seed round. So Paul is one of the earliest investors in Manifold. He is also a partner at Mythos, which is an early-stage VC firm investing in pro-social AI. He's extremely knowledgeable, and I'm so glad to have you here at Manifest this year. So give it up for Paul Gu.
Thanks, happy to be here.
Yeah, so I've got a list of questions. They're kind of like random, go over a bunch of different topics that I think Paul and I have like talked about a little bit before. And I also want to open it up to you all to like ask, jump in. Feel free to jump in. This is a really small crowd, so it can be like a little bit more intimate. Starting with prediction markets. So Paul, I think like the one thing you told me like a long time ago, which I still remember, is that like at one point in time you were like half the liquidity on Predictit or something like that. So can you like tell the audience, these guys, a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. We were just talking about that earlier, and it seems like you were maybe around back then too. But yeah, I mean, I think it was we were trying to figure out the timing, but I think maybe like 2015 or so, 2016, there started being these like markets that were fairly decent markets. That they started out as these polling markets, and they would be like things that like seemed like they wouldn't be like that interesting of questions, but it would just be like, what's going to be the real clear politics, like polling average on some particular question, and it would be like every week there'd be a number, or the 538 average, or later there were these like, how many times will Trump tweet this week, and then how many times will these various other accounts tweet this week, and there were basically like a sort of family of strategies that all were like pretty profitable because the market just wasn't that efficient back then. So you had like, there were literally sometimes you could just make money on straight arbitrage, where it's like you have these questions where, there's like yeses and nos, or like the sum of the things add up to way more than 100 or whatever it is. And some of those things, you just write code. And if the gap, because of the transaction fees, it didn't always work, but if the gaps got big enough, you could trade those. And then, you of course, from real arbitrage, you move on to like maybe like stat arb. And so you're like, okay, well, maybe you can't do that, but you can kind of like see, okay, well, in these like polling averages, there's always these like 9 polls. This particular polling agency releases a poll on average every like 3 weeks. And so that poll tends to have this particular skew. It's going to come in and do this or that. So those things weren't like well baked in. Sometimes you just sort of, you have family strategies doing that. Some of it was literally like sometimes you just have like sort of speed type arbs, and sometimes you have kind of like the Citadel market making thing where you're basically I tried to be like, because a lot of the markets had spreads of at least a few cents. And so it's like, if you didn't think, I mean, the risk was always that like the poll was about to drop, and if you're market making when there's a poll that drops and you're not the first to move, then you just get screwed. And so you sort of had to be like, okay, I'm pretty confident that during these hours, no polls get released. So during those hours, I'm always the market maker. And so you basically just like always have this bot that's like filling the bid ask all the time. And then, but then, you just have to be like, you have to also have this other stupid scraper that's checking the poll releases, so you don't get totally fried if that happens. And anyway, so you had this family of, regular arb, stat arb, market making, and sort of pure speed as sort of your 4 kinds of main strategies, and you're running all these strategies, and then it ends up you just do a ton of trades, and that was sort of my guesstimate, is that some large double-digit percentage of all the trades going on there were being done, and a lot of that is just because you're looking to make like a tiny amount on the trades.
Yeah, like my average profit was 2 cents per trade.
Yeah,
it's really small.
Yeah.
And another strategy is these tweet markets in particular were really volatile. Like, I don't, so there would be multiple different brackets. It might be like Trump will tweet 70 times or fewer this week, all the way up to 130 more in increments of 10. And let's say on a normal week, like half the time, 3 or 4 of these brackets are going to hit 70 cents or more. So people are paying because they really think, that for whatever reason, he's not been tweeting a lot. The market's about to run out. And people start bidding up the one that's currently active, and then he goes on a tweet storm at the last minute, goes on a bracket.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah. The tweet storm nature of it made those tweet markets really interesting, because especially because like the most interesting moments are like once he does one tweet, because then it's like conditional on he has tweeted one time in the last 1 minute. There's like an extremely high chance there's going to be more, and it's like this crazy distribution where there's like a chance it's going to be like 20 tweets, and so. that was fun, a lot of fun.
So this is like a few years ago, and you haven't really engaged much with prediction markets, at least like in this capacity since. I'm curious, then that was like trading in public markets. Have you considered using prediction markets like internally at Upstart or betting markets or bets for running your business?
Yeah, so I mean, the nature of what we do at Upstart, I mean, is there's a bunch of predicting of different things that goes on, and some of those things are like kind of like the right sorts of questions to. I mean, there's things that are common to every company. So like everyone talks about like, oh, maybe use prediction markets to figure out like how long a project will take or something like that, and those seem like sort of interesting, but I think they're not that interesting because the number of like people with information is usually not that large. So I think it's kind of like, well, actually only like 4 of us really know what's going on here. Yeah. So do you really need a market to like clear the information on 4 people? I don't think so. So like, it's like maybe if you're at like Google and there's like 800 people involved in a project, there's something to it. But even, you know, we're about 1,000 people, but, you know, most projects don't have more than 5 meaningful participants, and it's just like internally, I think there's not that much juice to squeeze out of it. But then there are all these questions that that actually are hard, sort of like external questions that we've determined are really like not good machine learning problems. So you know, we're in this business of we tried to get risk prediction right on various types of consumer loans, and we try to, you know, get a lot of edge over kind of what a traditional bank lender would do. And there's parts of that are like what we think of as the micro problem, which is like how do you separate and rank risk between like a bunch of different individuals, and we think we do that as well as anybody. But then there's like this other part of the problem, which is like macro risk, which is kind of like, okay, well, there's things that are kind of like highly correlated across like all consumers, or at least many consumers that go on. They're typically influenced by things that are not highly repeated over history. It's like there have been whatever, like 10 measured recessions in like recorded economic history. There's been maybe only like 4 major bouts of inflation. Like the number of times that sort of, you know, the Fed dramatically raises or lower rates is also like on, you know, you can count them on like 2 hands. And it's just like very poor machine learning problem, right? You can't train any kind of model on this. And almost each event is almost like each event has something unique about it. So it's like this most recent sort of like crazy roller coaster we went through was basically the results of like the stimulus in 2020 turned out to be like the greatest event ever for consumer loan repayment, because basically the sorts of people that are in debt were like the people who got the most stimulus, and those people suddenly had like an incredible ability to pay back all loans. But then, you know, 2 years later, the stimulus was withdrawn. It was like the worst sort of hangover ever, because it was like these people had basically gotten used to spending at a certain like rate because they had, you know, stimmy money, and then stimmy money just abruptly disappears over the course of a couple months. And like, of course, your like lifestyle habits don't change that fast. And then it's like repayment ability just fell off a cliff, and you could see that in things like the sort of measured personal savings rate. And that question is like, these questions are like macro questions, bad for ML, but like there's obviously a lot of information held by a lot of people out there. And so like, I think those are the sorts of questions we think there is potential for this. And so of course, you know, we've been talking to you guys about like how we might be able to sort of make some public markets on questions that we are especially interested in, for which we are not really the special holders of information.
I see. Yeah, that totally makes a lot of sense. I think, like you said, many companies come to us being like, oh, I want to forecast on OKRs.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily, there's not too many participants, like
exactly,
you said,
yeah,
who are interested in that. So at any point, you guys also feel free to jump in if you have like a point on this topic.
Yeah, this is probably a basic question, but is that default risk, is it hedgeable? Like, can you hedge that through swaps or something?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've obviously thought about this question like constantly, and in short, like I think, unfortunately, and I've kind of been disappointed by this. I think earlier in my career, I sort of thought that financial markets have sort of solved hedging problems, and it just turns out that actually, like, for hedging to be really efficient and not like prohibitively expensive, it needs to be like an ultra liquid market. Like, you know, you're talking about like things like, you know, there's decent hedging ability for like for interest rate swaps. Like interest rate swaps are like pretty good liquid market. Even then, they're not cheap to hedge, but at least it's not prohibitively expensive. But anytime you get into anything even like one step removed from like the thing that like is most kind of broadly interesting, the hedging markets become so expensive that like the sort of fee you would pay to do that is basically eats like, entire businesses worth of margins. And so in short, I think we think it's not possible in today's markets to hedge the kind of risk we're interested in, because it's not precisely, it's like if we're just trying to like, I mean, actually, even if you try to hedge something like, I don't know, like S&P 500 goes down a lot, that turns out to be a pretty expensive thing to hedge. And then so if you hedge some combination of that and interest rates and a few other things, it ends up being like a pretty expensive thing to pull off. And so what we've ended up doing is thinking about ways that we could sort of restructure the business model to be to essentially like smooth out the kind of like the sort of ups and downs by essentially locking in sort of the entities that are taking on the end risk in loans over the course of sort of a full economic cycle. So in the case of our business, essentially what happened was like the sort of banks and sort of like institutional investors that were exposed to loan risk produced from Upstart in 2018, 19, 2020, and 2021, like made probably something on the order of like twice as much return as they were like hoping to make. And then from late 2021 through 2022 and 2023, they made like half as much return as they were hoping to make. And if you like invested sort of like a uniform amount across the whole period, you would have done really well. But of course, like, people like that were doing well ramped up their investing, or like new people signed up, and so you end up having some people like stopped for various reasons. So you have some people that like did really well during a good time, and then you have like half the sort of like partner institutions that got completely burned and like now don't want to do business with you anymore. And actually, like, I think the right thing for everybody would have been some sort of thing where the sort of like upside performance is essentially like used to hedge later downside and vice versa. And so we've been structuring a bunch of contracts to do this kind of thing.
Interesting. It reminds me a bit of like Bill Ackman has a closed fund, like Pershing Square, the European version, and he basically has this capital locked in. So I'm wondering if that might be a mechanism to try and like get permanent capital for your.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. You basically, yeah, you need lock-ins, but then like you need something beyond the lock-in generally, because people want like, well, full credit cycles are just a really long time, and so in the case of a lot of these funds, there's usually some way to redeem, or maybe there's some liquidity you could trade it to somebody else, or there's something. Otherwise, at some point the liquidity premium then gets very high, and so you have to pay that. So there's. But yes, I mean, you're definitely right that in some way, shape, or form, like hedging this kind of macro risk is like pretty core to the business. But of course, if we could just get it more right via something like prediction markets, even better.
Yeah, traditionally, like one thing that Kalshi, for example, tries to pitch as like why prediction markets are socially valuable is that they provide this like opportunity for hedging. Have you like thought about this, or?
Yeah, I think it's true. Of course, like this is where we get back to the scale, right? It's like, well, what would it cost to, like. Where can you find a counterparty that wants to like sort of take on, I don't know, like $500 million of counterparty risk on the trade, right? And it's like they're hedging like a fairly obscure thing. It's like we specifically care about like the financial health of U.S. consumers in their ability to repay unsecured credit, right? Something like that. And it's like, well, most of the time when you find these like hedging trades, it's like it's on a thing where there is like a lot of parties that are interested in that core question naturally, and like something like interest rates affects all sorts of businesses, but this is like it's like a little too specific, and so obviously we can't go on Kalshi and be like, where's $500 million of counterparty? It's just like the bid-ask spread you'd have to take on that would be crazy.
Yeah. Bring it over to Manifold a little bit. I wanted to ask, why did you invest in Manifold?
Yeah. Well, let's see. So, I mean, I've done a moderate amount of like personal angel investing, and then, as you mentioned earlier, I now do some investing with Mythos. Really, I guess I would say I invest in companies for one of a few reasons. But I think in the case of you guys, it was kind of like I definitely like. I mean, at my core, like I'm a deep believer in the idea of prediction markets. Like I want them to succeed in the world, and I think especially when you're angel investing, like it's like, well, I mean, in some sense, you're trying to like predict which things will be successful, but in another sense, you're kind of just like saying like you're saying like I want this thing to exist and succeed, and then the other half of the equation is really just it's like so overset, it's like trite, but I think it's just. It's hard to like overstate the importance of just like just sort of founders and the right people, and it just sort of being like, hey, this is, I think the thing I especially like is when you have like a strong kind of founder problem fit, and most founders, even most good founders, even many founders I've invested in, are like opportunistically working on the problem. There's nothing wrong with that. I think people should be opportunistic, like, you know, be a good capitalist, whatever. But it's like, you're just like, it's just like, hey, if this year crypto is hot and next year AI is hot, like the year the thing is hot and the year you like start your business is going to be like, there's going to be a strong like determinant of what you work on. But then there's like a small minority of founders where it's like, no, regardless of which year it was, they were going to work on something like related to this. And when there's a very strong founder problem fit, and the problem happens to be one that, you know, you also like really want to see a solution in the world for, then, you know, it's a good reason to invest. So.
Thank you for that. I guess then since your investment, I'm curious, like, is there any ways in which Manifold has like positively surprised you or like disappointed you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Manifold, like, I mean, it went in a lot of like directions that I didn't, you know, I didn't quite like. I think both the positive and negative, I guess, surprise, it comes sort of from the same place, which is like sort of like this, right? Which is like you guys actually are like incredibly social people, and like you like sort of have this like large sprawling network that allows you to try crazy things like the dating thing or whatever. Whereas like that was not my mental model of like, you know, I was just like, oh, these are like three nerds in a basement. They know nobody knows them. Like prediction markets is like this arcane thing that like nobody cares about, and like, you know, they're going to be like sort of slaving away trying to find some like weird niche of like a market where there's like a lot of people that naturally have an interest in trading the thing. Maybe they'll like find their way to some kind of obscure like financial security where there's a lot of interest, or maybe it'll be something in crypto. But it's going to be definitely like three guys in a basement and who never see the light of day. And then it was like, then I would read these investor updates, and it was like, there's like a dating show, and then there's like all these crazy things, and then this conference, and it's the first time, I wasn't here last year, but it's like a real thing. And I'm like, whoa, like these guys like have friends. Like this is crazy.
Yeah, I don't think we had any of these friends actually before we started Manifold.
Yeah.
A lot of it is because of prediction markets.
Right.
It turns out that you can bring like people together when they like care a lot about one subject. I think basically like the 600 people who are coming here today, like all like passionately think that prediction markets are at least interesting, if not like are true believers that like will change the world.
Yeah.
So
that's awesome.
Sometimes you like send out the bat signal and people show up. Yeah.
That's super cool.
Cool. Then one story that you told me before, but I think is like really cool, is the way like Upstart started originally on income share agreements. This thing that like has fallen out of favor, I think, somewhat.
Yes.
But very early on, Upstart, I think, went through a pivot from income share agreements into loans.
Yep.
Right now, Manifold, we're going through a pivot, trying to go from just like a play money system into sweepstakes-based prize points, like cash-based rewards. And we're trying to think through like, how do we message that? How do we get like everyone on board? Mostly the community. Like our team is like sold on it. Anyways, can you talk about Upstart's pivot and any advice you might have Manifold for our pivot?
Yeah, sure. So we started the company back in 2012, and our original idea was to build income share agreements for kind of like broad any kind of purpose. And so the basic idea was like, we will give, you know, it's like people will apply for money just like they're applying for a loan. Then we're going to run some algorithms and then price the people. And so the price would be expressed in the form of like, we will give you, you know, $20,000 in exchange for 1.8% of your income for the next 10 years, or something like that, right? And every person would have like some very specific price and offer. And we did about maybe 300 or so of these things. So like a few $1 million worth of these contracts. Like it was like, you know, we kind of like got off the ground for sure. But then it was also like obviously going too slowly. And I think in hindsight, it's like more than obvious that we were like way too slow to pivot, where we had this meeting with one of our, well, it was a meeting of the board, but one of our investors, Josh Koppelman at First Round, he was like, I was just explaining something like, you know, this quarter we have these like 10 A/B tests we're going to run to like boost like the sign up rate, and it's going to be like, I don't know, we're going to change the button from red to blue, and then like, you know, instead of entering your email first in the form, you're going to enter it last, and like, you know, all the sort of growth marketing hacks that exist out there. Right? I probably read some stupid blog, and it was like, these 10 tricks always boost conversion by 50% or something, right? And so it was like, we're going to do all of the things that you could like find out there on the internet, and then. You know, Josh looked confused. I don't think he heard anything I said. And he just said something like, when I invested in this company, I thought there were going to be hordes at the gate looking for this money. Are there hordes of people at the gate? And then I was like, no. And then that was sort of like after that conversation, we're like, oh crap, like, you know, yeah, it's like we're not within like 10x of like the right answer here, and it's just like sort of was way premature to try to like optimize the thing when you didn't obviously have any kind of product market fit. And you know, it was like, I think we were just a little overly attached to the idea for, I think, some of the same kinds of like reasons that I think, you know, people here at this conference are like really passionate about prediction markets. And I think when you're really passionate, it was like income share agreements had like a similar thing, you know, it's like sort of this like, almost like this religious idea in some sense, because it just seems right. Like there's like, you could just write whole textbooks about like why it's better than like the alternatives that exist. And back then I used to go to a lot more conferences because, you know, conference people liked hearing about things like income share agreements. And like I was on like every sort of like major like, you know, TV thing like Bloomberg and CNBC and whatever. They all wanted to hear about this, but just no real customers wanted it. But like, you know, like Bloomberg loved to talk about this thing. And I think that was as much sort of a negative signal on the whole thing as anything. And so eventually we sort of, I think just in the nick of time, like got our act together and decided, okay, well, what do people seem to really want? And what we had observed was basically there were actually hordes of people at the gate, not for the income share agreements. They were just there being like, hey, I heard that like you give like money to young people who otherwise like don't get money. Like I'm that kind of person. Can you give me money? And then we'd be like, yeah. Like come in and we'll tell you like what percent of your income we need. And they'd be like, no. Can you tell me what APR I can get this money at? And then we'd be like, no. So you're missing the point. Like theoretical benefits of like, you know, APRs are bad. They like, you know, too much risk. You can hedge your risk away if you like instead take the income share, because then upside and downside and all these things. And then people were just like, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you tell me how much money I'll have to pay you back? And I'd be like, no, it's a percent of your income. You just make the spreadsheet, and if your income's a little higher, then you can see make yourself 5 tabs of, you know, if you make a lot of money, maybe you don't make a lot of money, and then people are like, so wait, how much do I have to pay you back? And then it's just eventually like, okay, you know what? Just tell them the answer. Just give them an answer. They want an answer, and listen to the people. But we were still so attached to the idea, so I was like, okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're going to do a sprint to build a standard like loan product that will still be underwritten with sort of these like different algorithms or whatever, but we're going to offer people side by side an income share agreement option and a loan option, because, you know, some people will want each, and over time, like the market will learn to appreciate the values of the income share agreement, and then it will, you know, the loan will just do some loans to like bridge us for a couple years, and then we'll be back to income share agreements. That was the vision. So then we built this thing, all the complexity of supporting this like side by side product, and then we launched it. And 100% of the people chose the loan. And then like literally 3 days later, after, you know, we had done this like 2-month-long build sprint to manage this complexity, I was like, hey guys, sorry, I think we need to delete all of this stuff over here because no one's choosing it. It's just in the way. And then we deleted it. And then you know, the rest is history. And eventually we became a public company giving people APRs.
Yeah, so I think this kind of like thing is like really hard to realize, like because you start with like a mission, and then you become attached to that mission. So I guess the question is like, how did you convince your team, and I guess if you had like existing like ISA customers, like that moving on to this different thing was the right thing to do? Yeah,
I mean, well, we still have the ISA customers because they were like, you know, long-dated income share contracts. So there's still people paying us, you know, 2% of their income like 10 years later. So I think they're almost done, though. I think they should be done any day now. 10 years has elapsed. But yeah, you can imagine like when it was like, you know, by the time like when we were like doing the IPO docs, and like the lawyers were like, what is this like weird like thing that you do? You are still collecting from like 300 people like 2% of their income. What is this? And like, is there a way to get rid of this? We're like, no, like it's just there's no way out. So that was so those people never migrated off. But yeah, I mean, I think the hardest part was migrating sort of ourselves off, and there was a real like, we had this offsite where we like debated this thing like late into the night, and it was like, well, like what are we even doing here, like, you know, and I think it was, there were really like the problem, we ended up having to decompose it into like a few sub-problems of like, well, what is the real like problem that we're solving? And it was like, well, you could view the problem as like, hey, people are getting all the money they want. It's just coming in the wrong form. which was maybe one interpretation of what we're doing. And the other is like adjacent, sort of different interpretation was like, actually, no, people just aren't getting all the money they want. And the thing they want more is the money and not the sort of like form of the money. And sort of, I think originally we sort of believed some combination of the two, like people aren't getting enough money when they need it and it's coming in the wrong form. And maybe they're not getting the money because it's coming in the wrong form or something like that. And I think we're just wrong about that. Like people just wanted the money and like they could care less what the form was. They just wanted to be like the most understandable thing. And because of, because that's what everybody's used to, like everybody knows like how basic loans work. You get X and you pay back Y, and like that thing is like well understood. They want, actually the more clear you can make Y, even I don't think APRs are that great, but the more clear you can make Y, like the better it is for people. And so I think just sort of migrating from like, hypothesis 1A to 1B, like sort of made the whole thing work. And now like in hindsight, it seems very clear. It was like originally we had sort of, three ideas and like 2 of the 3 were right. And it turned out that was enough to build a good business.
So out of those first 300 income share agreement customers, like that's a small enough number that I assume there was some human in the loop involvement in the early stages.
Yeah.
So who out of those was like the riskiest one that you were like, it wasn't like integrated into your algorithm, but you thought that, like maybe I should second guess my algorithm here, and how are they doing on their income share agreement?
Let's see.
Like don't say the name or whatever.
I don't know. I think we actually tried pretty hard not to sort of like manually take flyers on people, because it just sort of seemed like, well, we're not like, this is not like a VC business where it like doesn't really help us if we like sort of non-scalably like, put money into some person and then they do really well. Like it doesn't help us if it's not a repeatable formula. So the whole point was we were just like doing like repeatable formula things. And in some ways it did have like some resemblance to like kind of like the early versions of the Teal Fellowship, which is the program I did, because it was kind of like, well, in some sense, like the Teal Fellowship was funny because it was like the whole mission of it was like this anti-college crusade, but like the application process, at least in the early years for the Teal Fellowship, was exactly the same as a college application. It was literally like submit your SAT scores here, write 2 application essays, and do an interview. That was the application process for the Teal Fellowship, and identical. And I was like, wow, I'm gonna crush this. Like I'm good at college admissions, like so this is the same thing. And so not surprisingly, selected for some of the same. A subset of the same kinds of people who could like get into good colleges and whatever, and I think this kind of played out kind of similarly. Like we were like, well, okay, you might have these people who are, because they have this money, might make slightly different choices, but in the end, I think it did end up mostly working out that like, oh, the person who quits their like management consulting job at like Bain like ends up still like doing about as well on average as like the people who stayed management consultants.
I've been a strong believer for many years that the mass affluent and mass credit market is too small, because most of the loans are collateralized by either houses or cars, nothing else.
Yeah.
And unsecured loans are not very large. But then I looked at when I looked at your website, well, you manage bad debt by using data in a very different way than credit scores and how banks do it. But it was strange to see that your price is not very different. Your price is at par with banks, if not sometimes higher. Why is that? Why did the additional data and kind of new way of doing this, which I think is better, did not reduce the price of these loans, given that assumedly you'd have less bad debt?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think the it's a good question. The simple answer is really the simple answer is really just that, like prices are individualized. And so like there's sort of in some sense like a price for everyone for every type of credit. So it's like no matter who you are, there's somebody out there who will lend to you under some set of terms. The terms might get progressively more terrible as you become like harder to, less legible or more objectively risky. But there's like always a price. And so then like when you look at a particular lender's price, the interesting combination of characteristics to look at is like, who are the people that they're lending to, and what is the price? Because there's no like, it's not like, you know, there's depending, if you only lend to like, you know, if you only lend to like really well-off people, well, you could have like a really low average average price for your loans. If you only lend to like really risky people, you might have a really high average price for your loans. Now, the interesting question is in like the relative to the characteristics of the pool of people you're lending to, how are your prices? And so in our case, like compared to probably like most of the sort of like lending type businesses that you would generally hear about, those businesses typically cater to, call it like, you know, I always hate compressing things back to just credit scores, but it's maybe easier for discussion purposes. If you were just to sort of compress everything to one dimension of like credit scores, like a typical bank, for example, their average customer is probably about a 780 on the credit score spectrum. An average sort of like fintech lender that you would have heard of would be averaging about 720. And then we're serving customers that are more like, you know, sort of like 660 type customers. And so like, if you were to sort of like make a curve of like market average prices at these different credit scores, of course, it's like, as you get to worse scores, the prices get higher. And then we basically are running something like, call it up, not quite, maybe like 40% lower than the sort of line until you get to about 700, where we then intersect the line. And that's so basically for someone who maybe has like fairly bad credit, like something like a 620 credit score, our sort of like average rate differential would be quite large. It would be something like maybe you might average a, I don't know, like a 36% APR somewhere else, and with Upstart you might average like a 25% APR. You could say 25%, that's still like super high, but 25 is also like quite a bit lower than 36. That's kind of, so I think that's where we add value.
So this reminded me of something that I was thinking about like 2 weeks ago. With tools like Intuit, Credit Karma that like train you to bump your credit score on paper, but they advertise to people at bumping your credit score as a way to just get access to more money so you can increase your spending. Like, is this causing inflation in credit scores? Like, are they more or less meaningful than they were before this phenomenon happened, or was like more widespread? And what's going on there?
Yeah, there is some credit score inflation. It's not just the main factor is not that. I don't think the training actually is like terribly effective. I think the main factor is that there's like when, you know, people talk about how like insurance for lawsuits is always getting more expensive because like juries are awarding larger and larger sort of like, you know, amounts of money to people in claims courts. There's like a similar phenomenon in credit scoring where, because there's so much like public attention on it, it's like a sort of regulatory issue, a PR issue. There's like always this pressure to be like, well, hey, this person only defaulted on their debt because they had a medical emergency. We shouldn't count that against them. Or like, you know, people need a second chance, so you got to delete all the sort of bad stuff after a certain number of years, or these categories of things should be excluded. And so there's actually sort of methodological inflation in traditional credit scores that happens because of like literally every year something changes that like slightly boosts like credit scores, and for some people significantly. And of course, it's just like, you know, in some sense, like once you recognize that it's all getting graded on a curve, like it doesn't do anything to inflate all the scores. But that is what's happening. For us, interestingly, it doesn't really matter too much for us because we don't care that much about those credit scores. We've got sort of all the like kind of base signals, so you don't care too much about it. But actually, the score ends up being really still relevant in our models, but often as a almost like an opposite adverse selection driven variable, where it's like when people have high credit scores, you know that like there are lots of other options available to them. And then we observe this interesting pattern where high credit score people who take our loans are just like worse, all else equal, because it's like if there are like 100 banks that would like offer you a loan, why did you like come to us? And the fact that you did, like, there's often something wrong. It's like you're like super desperate, you don't really care, or like actually like your banker knows something about you that like is hard to observe, and they just won't give you money anymore. Like, and so we've got this weird like opposite signal because of this weird selection bias effect.
Is it correct to say your models are more forward-looking than credit scores, and if so, do you see more opportunity to work in that direction, to be better at forward-looking forecasting of whether people would default or not? And how much can you go beyond what the current banking system provides?
Yeah, is it more forward-looking? I think in a general sense, the answer is yes. I mean, I guess it a little bit depends what you mean by forward-looking. I mean, obviously, like, we are literally trying to just make predictions about the future. That's like the only thing that we're.
As opposed to credit scores, which only account like for past data, and your credit score is basically a picture of the past.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess all models are trained on and do inference based on signals that have already happened, because otherwise you wouldn't have the signal. And all models are trying to make predictions about the future. So in that sense, like, you know, I'm not sure that they are like structurally different as models. Like the credit score, what traditional credit scores literally are is like they just like take only signals of your past credit behavior. I think that's the sense in which it's most obviously different from what we do. Is like they're like, we will only consider what you have done in the past with credit and nothing else. And then they take those factors and say, let's predict if we were to give you a credit card, what is the likelihood you would become 60 days late on your credit card within 12 months. That's like actually what the sort of like traditional credit score is like trained and targeted to do. So then, but then it gets used in all sorts of other applications, like, oh, you know, hey, you're trying to buy a house that is going to be a 30-year mortgage, you know, that's like $600,000, and they just sort of use the score that was like trained for this like 60-day credit card delinquency thing, which, you know, doesn't translate one-to-one. Anyway, so I think the thing we do that's most different is we consider a bunch more factors, and then, you know, the models themselves are much more they're sort of able to catch much more nuance because they're not linear models, and then to your second part of your question, yes, I think there's an enormous amount of room for the models to keep getting better. Like essentially, it's like if you think about how much unexplained variance there is in like who pays back loans and who doesn't. Like if sort of like pure randomness is, if you called that like a 0, and like sort of perfect prediction would be like 100, and then I would say like maybe traditional banks are somewhere at like 5, and we're like somewhere at like 11 on this sort of scale. So yeah.
Question?
I have a question. Harkening back to your ISA days, what do you make a Lambda school?
Yeah, Lambda school. So we were really early to this sort of income share game. We took an approach that was like, we want this to be general purpose. You could use it for anything. And then, you know, I think as our thing stopped working, I think then there was like this wave of companies that was like, okay, actually like the use case is going to be for schooling. And there were basically 2 branches. There was like the normal schooling people, like, you know, they were going to use it at like Purdue or something. And then there was like the sort of alternative school people like Lambda, and they were going to use it for coding boot camps. And there was something appealing about, and we thought about this during the pivot a lot. It was like, well, should we just do this for the education use case? And the education use case helped with one large problem, which was, in some sense, it helped with the explainability and therefore the sort of customer acquisition problem, because, you know, they've centralized it for you and it sounds sort of legitimate that this institution's offering to you. But it came with a major downside, which is that they sort of had to offer the same deal to everyone. And that was sort of, I think, a major disadvantage relative to the sort of original thing, because you have to offer the same deal to everyone, and outcomes are not, you know, completely random. Like there's some amount of like predictability to the outcomes, like, you know, whatever some people are like more confident that they're going to like do well after the coding bootcamp, other people less well. You have a pretty severe adverse selection problem. And I think, you know, ultimately, as I understand with Lambda School, I know them like a little bit, but as I understand, basically what happened is, in some sense, like this problem forced them to make more and more kind of like aggressive claims about like what kinds of outcomes you could expect from Lambda School, and then you know, ultimately, like, it was not possible to keep up with those claims at scale. In some sense, I think because, you know, just like if you read some like Brian Kaplan stuff on like education, right, you're just like, well, actually it's just hard to causally make that many people like that much more successful by sort of pure education intervention strategy. And so then you're stuck in this world where it's like, well, you can't actually scalably do it to that many people, and then, you know, then you start having all sorts of problems. So.
Yeah, Vincent is famously the founder.
Hey. Thank you. It's great to answer your question.
One of the people who wrote an expose on Lambda School.
Okay,
I think.
yeah.
I don't know if you
Oh,
might
I
have
did
come
not know
across-
that, but
okay.
no, I may have seen it. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, on ISAs, this is also a thing that I think I've talked with you about a little bit. I'm still pretty bullish on ISAs. I think especially in the world of like the internet creator, there's a lot more of like a potential market for it where like you now have these individuals who are kind of like businesses on their own. They like, stream, they write on Substack, they like make TikTok videos, and they generate a bunch of revenue, but possibly like a lot of revenue like down the line. Do you see like a business there for income share agreements?
Maybe. So I don't understand. I don't really know too much about like how the exact sort of businesses here work. I guess maybe what I would say is the things I would worry about are one is you have to worry about diligence transaction costs a lot, which is like if it takes. So like for any kind of like thing to work, it has to be, the cost of evaluating whether to like do the transaction has to be a small percentage of the value of the transaction. Otherwise, like the tax is too high, and then it doesn't make sense for anybody to do. And so when Dave, my co-founder, and I first met, he actually had wanted to build Upstart as like an eBay-like auction for the ISA, and he was like, oh, it's going to be great, people are going to post a little pretty picture of themselves, and everybody's going to bid and be like, and find the market clearing price that way. And I was just convinced him there's no way it's going to work because like it might be like a fun toy, but like at any kind of as a serious endeavor, like the human cost of evaluating like how good do I think this other human is going to be is like non-trivial. It's not like you can just like glance at them. You have to like kind of like read a lot about them, like kind of like figure out what they're trying to do, and then like you probably put in like multiple hours of time into this like evaluation, and then for the market to work, you need a bunch of people to do that. Now it's like imagine 100 people have each spent 5 hours each evaluating this person. 500 human hours have been spent to do like a single $20,000 transaction. It's doomed from the start, right? And so I think generally this is also why like there's this enduring mystery that people constantly going after. I'm an LP in this this fund called Indie.vc, and they sort of have this thesis. But there's been this constant question like, why are they only interested in like billion-dollar outcomes? Well, this is kind of weird, right? Because it seems like you could build lots of good like $50 million businesses, and those are good businesses. Like, why is there no like substantial market of people to invest in those kinds of businesses? And basically, there's not. And it's like, of course. But of course, from like a efficient markets sort of perspective, it's like, well, there should be, because these businesses have been around longer than these kind of like hyper scaling tech businesses as like a business model. They've been around since the dawn of human history, and yet there's no like sort of decent sort of network of investors for those kinds of businesses. And why is that? And I think at least one part of the problem is this like diligence transaction cost problem, which is like it takes almost as long to like understand what your like plumbing business does and whether your customers are real. Am I going to do like channel checks and call like your house and be like, hey, is this guy a good plumber? And then like you'll be like, how many times more do you expect to use this plumber next year? And then call like 10 houses, and then I'm like, oh crap, this only added up to like $10,000 of revenue, and I spent 10 hours calling these random people about how good their your toilet fixes are, and that makes the transaction cost very high. And so I fear a similar kind of thing where it's like if the businesses are too bespoke, then it gets hard. But maybe there's something like very recurring about it. So like there have been some moderate successes with people trying to do these like things for like factoring type businesses where it's like, hey, you basically have like you have already sold some stuff, you just haven't gotten paid yet, and like those businesses, there's like factor financing that's fairly sort of scaled up and successful.
Sorry, what is factor here?
That's just the name of this. It's basically like it's like I sell I sell widgets on Amazon, and I've already sold these widgets, but Amazon has this like horrendous like 6-month payment policy. You don't get paid for like 6 months. So it's like I know Amazon's going to pay me 6 months from now, but I'm totally broke between now and 6 months from now. I essentially can take Amazon's debt to me. That they will pay me in 6 months and use that to get credit, and so there's a whole network of factoring businesses. And that's factoring is a little more than that, but that's the basic idea. You have high confidence in doing a certain amount of business, and you sell sort of the rights to that to get financing. So that's a kind of thing like this that has worked. But in general, the more close you get to equity, the more you need to understand the unique characteristics of the business. Then the diligence costs get high, and so you have to overcome that.
So how is AI not a way to reduce the cost of doing due diligence?
Totally.
Allowing these small VC firms to focus on the $50, $100 million company?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that is like that's definitely, I think, like one of the right thoughts to have. Like, I think it seems right. Like there's at least some kinds of these businesses for which it will now be possible to efficiently underwrite them in a way that was not before. And I think it's just like before you could only do this for businesses where you evaluate the numbers, because the numbers you could stick into various frameworks for evaluation. But suddenly we have the ability to do that with words, and that's should change some stuff. So someone's going to get a win there.
Yeah, that was related to the question I had. Upstart was pretty early to AI, I think, and as a result, your Upstart is a public company now. I think at one point it was kind of like a meme stock almost for people who like wanted to bet on the future of AI. They just like bought Upstart. With the massive move over to the LLM style kind of machine learning, which is I think somewhat different than what Upstart's usually known for. Like, how do you think your business holds up? What are your like plans with this like LLM stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you said is true. It's not really like a thing we like think too much about, because it's kind of like, well, we're like in the hot meme target. Now we're not in the hot meme target. It was like, that's not exactly what we're optimizing for. So it's sort of fine. But I mean, yeah, it's definitely true that I mean, I don't know, we weren't like, we never got to like GameStop status, but like we were like at least somewhere in the thread. Like, if you made money on GameStop, where do you go next? Like there was a thing there. That was, it's not really like necessarily a good thing, but it was a thing. Now it's not a thing. I would say maybe the real parts of that we think about are like, the thing that really did change from 2021 to today is many things, but I think one of the core ones is the interest rate environment is very different. Like, I think we're, not being at zero rate anymore is like super different, and I think that has multiple levels of implications for our business and for lots of hyperscale businesses. If you look at like IPOs from 2021, like they're not good. Like the sort of like our IPO class, like we were probably like one of the better performers still in the class. Like we went public at 20. I think we're maybe like 25 today. And we had been trading as high as 400 during this sort of combo of like zero interest rates plus like sort of meme target. Like was like, okay, I guess we're at 400 now. But 25 is not bad relative to 20. Especially look at that IPO class, and it's because like everybody in some sense was priced in like a zero like discount rate world, and suddenly the discount rate is non-zero, and it like busts a lot of spreadsheet models.
I'll circle back to due diligence, and I'm curious, you're an investor yourself, so what kind of due diligence that you do, and also like given your founding history, do you think there are like any unique things that you would especially look for?
Well, early stage investing is, I guess, part of the reason people love to do it is because like the most important thing and the sort of like lazy and fun thing happen to be the same thing, which is like the most important thing is actually just founder quality. And like, people, it's like enjoyable to meet great people. And so it's like, well, all you have to do is just like randomly bump around and like bump into cool people. And you're like, oh, this person has it, and then it's like, I want to be involved in that. And I think actually that is the thing that matters in these, again, this is a very specific like sort of like VC circle Venn diagram thing of like when you're talking about like very early stage businesses and businesses where it's kind of like the ambition is to get really big or go nowhere at all, and then sort of hyper indexing and founder quality becomes so important because it's like all the other early signals it's like are only an indirect signal on the founder quality. So it's like they don't really care like how much revenue you have after working on this for 6 months. It's not relevant unless you're trying to build your local plumbing business. Then maybe it's relevant, but otherwise it's not relevant, except that it tells me maybe about how fast the founder moves or maybe how resourceful they are, something like that.
Cool.
How did you meet your co-founder David?
Yeah, so Dave's quite a bit older than me. In fact, we often joke he's my dad's age. And so basically I had dropped out to do the Teal Fellowship. I was sort of like thinking about an income share idea, probably from like reading like Marginal Revolution or something like this, right? And then Dave had been at Google for a bunch of years and got to thinking about a very similar idea. And so we like both started working on this thing like kind of independently. And as I mentioned earlier, he had this like eBay version of the idea, and I wanted to like build models and price the contracts. And I started just trying to like meet people who knew something about this. We both did. We both networked our way, both through like multiple connections to this one woman named Noga Levner, who is now an entrepreneur in her own right. But she had previously been the CEO of this like sort of like non-profit-y thing that was trying to do income share agreements for education in the US. And she was like the one person in the US market who had ever done an income share agreement. So we both networked our way to her. And we both tried to convince her to do the thing with us, because she was the only person who knew anything about it. She had done it for several years. She knew lots of the operational messes, and she was like, "I'm never doing this again. I don't recommend it." But hey, just the other day, I met another crazy person who also wants to do this thing that I don't recommend you do, and then she introduced the two of us, and then I think my sort of like initial value add was I convinced Dave that like we can't run the eBay auction on people, and then we decided to start working together.
Okay, so we only have 2 more minutes, so I think just one last question. Maybe I'll go down there.
Do you think the business model of buy now, pay later is a bad idea in theory, but a good idea in practice?
It's a bad idea in theory, but a good idea in practice. Yeah, I mean, I do think it's a good idea in practice for sure. Do I think it's a bad idea in theory? What makes you say that? Is there something you have in mind when you say it's bad in theory?
Well, I mean, what does it do in theory beyond just being a loan like that you can't capture with a more standard offering?
Oh, yes, I actually think it does.
The answer is maybe marketing, and that's why it's good in practice. Or
No, I think what it's doing actually is it is so. Merchants are always looking for secret ways to offer discounts. That is a core problem of being like a merchant to consumers. You have very high margins generally. Like if you sell like jeans, your margins are super high. And so you're always secretly willing to offer discounts, but you can't, because doing so would it's basically a failure of price discrimination. There's, like airlines have some ability to price discriminate, but like most products have no ability to price discriminate, right? Like jeans are sold at the same price like to everybody. And this is a colossal failure of being a jean business. You're like, I'm just not maximizing my profit extraction, because all these people, if I double the price of the jeans, would still buy it, but then these other people wouldn't buy it at all. So how do you secretly offer discounts? Well, it turns out BNPL is like this super sneaky way to offer discounts. Why? Because essentially the BNPL provider is just saying, hey, I will offer a super low interest or no interest loan to this person. Of course, money is not free. There's a real cost in there. Who's paying that cost? It's the merchant. So the merchant is paying the BNPL provider, because the merchant's like, I don't care if I lose like 10% of the transaction. That's just a 10% discount. That's nothing. I offer like 20% discounts like on holidays all the time, right? And they're like, but I'm only going to now offer this to the sorts of people who otherwise would be sort of unable to buy this product, because they're the sort of people who need to like borrow $100 to buy the pair of jeans. And I just gave them a targeted 10% discount without being unable to sell $100 jeans to like the people who couldn't afford it.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, but you can follow Paul outdoors there if you'd like to talk with him a little bit more, if that's okay with you. If you have more time.
Sure.
Yeah, let's give it up one more time for Paul Gu. All right,
Okay.
Thank you so much for doing this
Awesome.
with me.
Yeah,
I need to go
fun.
to a different talk. So
Yeah,
I
no, go for it,
go for it. Yeah. All right.
Maybe it's a terrible idea, but